All right, feedback on last week's assignment. Before I get started, yeah, any questions you might have, let me know, drop me an email, stop me after class. If you want, if you have specific questions over certain concepts, theories, ideas, or whatever it may be, let me know. For the most part, everyone's like in the space of defining and explaining, as I mentioned before, what I look for when I'm evaluating papers is clarity of definition, explanation, and being sufficiently thorough to get into the content area. So I'll kind of go over some things that were just, I don't know, areas of clarification or things to add or reinforce that I picked up from the papers. C. Wright Mills, right, is looking at that kind of the influence of history, culture, social forces, anything that's outside this, outside the self, the sort of interaction between the individual and the environment, the context, historical, cultural, social context, that private trouble and public issue, and the intersectionality between them. So our own biography, our own experience is connected to larger social kind of forces. Very similar, a couple you mentioned, like the parallel between that and Durkheim's idea of social facts. Durkheim, the idea of social facts, I mean, there's an overlap for sure going on there. The idea for Durkheim is to focus on all those external influences that are shaping patterns of human behavior. So yeah, external influences, whatever they may be, that are shaping people's experiences, shaping their behavior, their attitudes, just sort of shaping outcomes. A little bit of clarification on Mead and Goffman. This gets a little tricky, and maybe the I don't know, just like making the application, but I think it's like the definition needs to start with defining or separating, how to separate out Mead and Goffman. Yes, Mead's perspective, that thinking before acting, right? So individuals, we learn, Mead was a behaviorist focused on that all of our actions are based on something that we've learned. And so he's focused on this process of learning. We think before we act, and we think by taking the position of other, whether that's the specific other or specific others, or the people that we come in direct contact with, or this idea of the generalized other, this idea of the expectations from larger society kind of thing. So yeah, everything's learned behavior. So learning, like how we sit is a learned phenomenon. We learn it by kind of taking the role of other, and then imagining how other people see us from that particular perspective. Somebody mentioned that that the words, I thought just sort of bring this up just because it's like interesting to kind of evaluate or think about the sort of word choice or how we think about Mead, whether or not. Okay, so men aren't man-spreading purposefully. So the idea of whether it's purposeful or not. And I wonder, Mead would probably say that, well, Mead would say, no, it's purposeful, that there's actually a conscious effort in terms of how a person sits, but it's how we think about that. It's not like individuals are, before they sit down, think about, well, how am I going to sit today or in this environment? But it's something that was learned over a period of time. To some point, it just gets habitual, and it's something that we do. The way that we sit, the way that we carry ourselves becomes natural. It just becomes part of our expression of our identity, expression of our experience. But it is learned behavior. It's something that we purposefully do in the sense that it was a conscious decision over a period of time to carry oneself in a particular way. Goffman, would get into, like you were, talking about the dramaturgical nature, our behaviors, a theatrical performance that we're performing for an audience. So how we sit is an expression of a script. So a lot of you use that language of script, which is right in that wheelhouse. One thing I should just to add, I didn't really come across until, I don't know, like the last year in a podcast on Goffman, was that his idea is not only that it's performance, but that's how we become who we are. So, or how we become, this person that we are, our behavior is because we engage in a script, we become that, so to speak. So it's not only just a performance, but it becomes an expression of who we are. And that's how we learn. Marx's perspective, most everyone's in the right, the spot of social justice or social injustice, examining injustice to promote greater justice. One student mentioned, Marx's perspective on the organization of labor, which I thought was, an important contribution, and how we can relate that to gender and patriarchy or male domination in society itself. And it's the organization of labor. Marx's perspective was on this idea of materialism, our economic structure. And if you go back to like different types of societies, hunting and gathering, societies, but for the great span of human history. And then we get into agricultural-based societies 8,000 years ago. And then we get industrial capitalism, like these different material structures come with different gendered relations kind of thing. And it's the organization of labor that's driving or influencing or shaping the degree of inequality between males and females in society. Masculinities and femininities. Surprised that there's some like misconception of that terminology. So it's just about putting the masculinities, the IES at the end, is to identify its intersectional nature. So there's not one masculinity or one femininity, but it's being shaped by or influenced by race, by class, by region of country, by culture. So there's not one form of masculinity, femininity. So it's this intersectional nature. Hegemonic masculinity, a little bit trickier. I think one language that somebody wrote is that it's learned or reinforced through culture. So it's something that we learn. We learn certain ideals, certain values and beliefs, and we learn it, and then it's reinforced through culture. It's maintained. Another student said it's maintained by us, and we are the ones that are, that continue to repeat something or continue to help maintain a way of thinking, knowing, doing that's reinforcing or benefiting the dominant group. You could relate this to fad discourse a little bit from Pasco's article, that when boys are engaging in this work, high school students, male high school students are engaging in this, a fad discourse. They're contributing to a system of division and separation. They're doing it for their, demonstrating their own masculine self, for status and belonging and connection to their social group. And those might be the motivations and reasons, but I think it's a powerful example to start thinking about hegemony in this way. It's that, it's like giving consent. It's like engaging in it. In fact, engaging in it for one's own self-gain kind of thing. Hypermasculinity, the key part there was putting it in a context, 1960s, 1970s, 80s, feminist movement, gay rights movement, challenge for sort of basically the white male dominant kind of view was being challenged on so many different fronts. The dominant forms of masculinity, and hyper masculinity comes in response to some of that kind of stuff. Interesting in the podcast, the issue of biological determinism. We didn't talk about that in class, but it kind of came up in a couple of writings. This idea of, testosterone in the womb shaping the male brain, and the kind of the caution to take in going down that pathway of thinking about these sort of biological determinant kind of aspects of, to explain different outcomes for males and females in society, whether that's academic, occupation, wealth, social position. Sometimes there's been a long history of leaning on nature or identifying nature as the reason for a particular outcome. So we don't have, a number of CEOs in the United States or, around the world in most countries, males and females, the difference between, the high number of males compared to females. The danger of going down the nature argument is that, well, if you go down the nature argument fully, you'd say, well, that's that way because that's just the way that nature operates, and there's nothing you can do to change that. It's an expression of innate characteristics of males and females. So if you go down into a pure pathway, I think it's just like faulty to think about it's all nature. If you go down the path, but the challenge becomes one if you don't want to under or overplay nature or nurture. So how do you find that sweet spot between the two? We have a long history, or we in the West, other countries and places have this sort of using biological arguments to support ways of thinking, knowing, to to support a system of inequality, basically. And to throw a caution to say, okay, well, it must be in utero what's going on in testosterone. It's influencing male and female brain development. And that's the reason. It's like, whoa, that's potentially going to underplay the role of nurture. And sometimes people can grab onto something within nature to support a particular perspective. So I mean, that's the challenge. I mean, is figuring out the interrelationships between nature and nurture and the interconnectivity between them as well. And then finally, with fag discourse, that racial dimension, I think, is an important one, intersectional dimension, which is a pretty powerful thing. Think about that fag discourse is a white male project and not one engaged in, for the most part, within Pasco's article by African-American boys, within high school, they're not engaged in that discourse. White boys were within that environment. So thinking about the racial dimensions of this kind of choice of language. And there's still homophobia, right? Homophobia can exist in different communities of people, but it's being expressed in different ways. All right, that's about it. If you have, like I said, if you have any questions, let me know. Have a great day, and see you in class tomorrow.